Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome back to Media Nation. We are talking about the Trudeau government's planned changes to the Broadcasting Act to include changes to regulate the internet. We just discussed this issue with journalist John Robson, who wrote a piece on this in the National Post. And I'm pleased to introduce our next guest, Senator Leo Housakos. He's joining us today to discuss this because Senator Housakos said this piece of legislation is an affront to our freedoms of speech. It's putting our rights, our charter rights at risk. And he's so outraged about it. I share in the outrage, and I'm happy you can join us today. Welcome, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us.
Karlene, thank you for having me on the show and on such an important issue.
Senator, it's shocking to me. I've been a Canadian for many years. I've never seen a government so tone deaf on concerns on the part of Canadians. When Canadians are pushing back and saying they're deeply concerned and angered at the fact that this federal government is looking to push through this piece of legislation, even though there's a hue and cry out against it, over concerns that our rights to free speech online, on social media, will be severely trampled upon if the changes go through. But the government seems tone deaf to this issue.
There's no doubt, Karlene. We have seen over the last few years a Trudeau government that seems to be running like an autocracy, driven by a bureaucratic autocracy, and tone deaf is actually quite an appropriate characterization. I think it should be very concerning to all of us and be completely unacceptable for a Canadian government to be basically, or the CRTC for that matter, to be granted the power to determine what Canadians watch or say or what they post online. And C-10 is probably the most breathtaking power grab over online speech that we've ever seen in the history of this country. And obviously, it's been a brief history that we've seen the power of the web arrive, and it's a tool that could be used for very positive elements and very negative elements. But nonetheless, we've never seen governments try to weaponize it and use it for what I'm afraid might be for political expediency. And furthermore, I think all Canadians understand that the web is an uncharted territory, that web giants like Google and Facebook, et cetera, need to be part of our framework, and they need to pay their fair share. For example, when it comes to royalty content and content royalty, and issues of that matter. And of course, that's been addressed in nations like Australia and France. But in this particular instance, the CRTC with Bill C-10, under the guidance of any government, because let's face it, the CRTC is a body of political appointees. And with C-10, they will have the ultimate capacity to decide what you and I watch, what we post, what we read, and they will deem what's acceptable on YouTube, on Twitter, on Netflix, on Crave, on Google, on Facebook, on Instagram. All of these platforms have become a significant part of how Canadians garner information and how we put out information.
The key motivation here, perhaps, is of and this criticism has been leveled at the federal government. It's a way perhaps to shut down criticism of the government. If you're out there saying supposedly what they deem as hurtful, if you're making hurtful comments, they literally said if you hurt somebody's feelings, you could be shut down. It seems absolutely astronomical to me, unbelievable to me, that the government would venture into this area and not remove the clause that talks about the user content.
It's not surprising to me. let's not forget that this is a government that doesn't take criticism very well. In 2015, when they got elected, they promised to be the most open, most transparent government. And of course, you in the media have seen over the last 5-6 years how difficult it is to ATIP things. How many times you get back requests for information from the government and they're redacted or blacked out, or how often this government, when their back is to the wall, they'll use prorogation. Or they'll suspend Parliament to basically hide from things. Look, I'm not going to mince words. Justin Trudeau has publicly stated a number of years ago that one of the regimes in the world he admires the most is the Chinese Communist regime. He's also a prime minister in Canada who called Fidel Castro a great leader. So he has a panache to admire and to be very respectful of dictators and tyrants. So let's call this what it is. This is a bill that absolutely will give authority to a government agency, and regardless of what political party is in power, the capacity to decide what individual Canadians want to see and ask for. And you're right, there's been a number of amendments basically tightening up a lot of loose ends when it comes to privacy and individual rights and freedoms in this country in this bill. And the government at every turn refuses to accept those amendments. Now at committee on the House of Commons side, there's a request to press pause, essentially, to send the bill to the Justice Department for review, to see exactly where the elements of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms when it comes to freedom of speech are trampled by this particular bill, and we see the Liberals fighting it at every turn. And of course, the NDP, depending on the on the day, they seem to acquiesce to this Liberal lunacy. And I want to highlight, Karlene, that Canada was built on people going overseas once upon a time and spilling their blood on behalf of freedom and democracy. And freedom is ultimately what Canada is based on. And somehow I'm very discouraged that there seems to be a bit of apathy and not enough of political outcry by all Canadians who should look at this as nothing more than an affront to their capacity to freedom of speech.
Most definitely, Senator Housakos, because when we look, we're a country of immigrants. Many Canadians come from countries where you have these draconian rules, draconian communist laws, where they shut down what you can say online, where they arrest you and lock you up, torture you. You wind up possibly murdered if you say the wrong things online. And I don't want to compare what the government is putting forward in those terms, but there's always the opening the gateway to some sort of control of the Canadian population. This government has a penchant for that type of thing. And as you very astutely pointed out, Trudeau has a love affair with communism. He talked about his admiration for China, his deep admiration for Cuban communism, and his admiration for Castro. And this concerns me deeply, that we have a prime minister now in office who is a communist, may very well be a communist sympathizer. I don't understand it. What's the end game here?
Look, he's a prime minister who actually paused, Karlene, just a few weeks ago when they asked about Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig getting a fair trial in China. He actually paused. He had to think about the answer if they were going to get a fair trial. So that in itself is concerning. But for me as a legislator, as a senator, and I think for all Canadians, our laws and our charter have to be ironclad. They have to be solid, and they have to eliminate any wiggle room for any prime minister, current or future, who think that power is there at their discretion. Because, to use a very famous term, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And anybody in office, the only thing they have as a check to hold them back are our laws. And this law, C-10, would completely destroy the protection of freedom of speech in this country. And as so appropriately you pointed out, all Canadians, immigrants, children of immigrants like myself, we've come to this country because of our freedom. It's fundamental to who we are. And I'm also a believer in the free market and free enterprise. And I believe, Karlene, that at the end of the day, it's Canadian eyeballs and Canadian viewership that has to determine our content. Because at the end of the day, I think Canadians know what they want. And I don't think it's incumbent on the CRTC and a bunch of politicians sitting in a corner deciding what Canadians should be watching. That is determined by the marketplace. It's determined by Canadians. And I believe in that fundamentally. So Bell Media and Global and CBC, giddy up and get your acts together, because if you're being outperformed by Crave and by Netflix and by others, that's quite frankly your problem. It's not incumbent on legislators and, again, the autocracy in Ottawa to determine how to save your butts if you're not efficient and effective.
And so, Senator Housakos, could you give us a sense what happens now? We understand that the federal Conservatives, federal NDP, the federal Bloc MPs, they all appear to be supportive of suspending Bill C-10 clause by clause to review it and to ensure there's no infringement of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So what happens now?
Well, I hope that common sense will prevail, and finally all opposition parties, and currently in the House of Commons we're in a minority parliament, so that's a good thing. So if all opposition parties, I think, vote in favor of this very reasonable expectation, which is we put a pause. At the end of the day, our number one responsibility as parliamentarians is to make sure that any piece of legislation is constitutional. And I think it's reasonable, given the outcry right now from so many privacy experts and freedom of speech experts, academics and lawyers across the country that have raised a red flag, that we pause, we send it to the Justice Department for a fair evaluation, a judgment on the constitutionality of this particular bill. And again, I think if anybody looks at it carefully, they'll certainly come back and point out the holes in it, the gaping holes and the risks, the draconian. This can easily lead to something very ugly if we aren't vigilant about it today.
I thank you so much, Senator Leo Housakos. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope I pronounced your name correctly there.
You absolutely did, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about an issue so important. And like I said, once Canadians tune in on this, they'll be just as concerned as you and I. So thank you very much, Karlene.
And thank you very much, Senator Leo Housakos. Thank you so much for joining us today.